Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. For those of you new here, hello, my name is Skylar. I am a certified dog trainer and pet nutritionist. On the channel we've talked a lot about raw pet food, whether it be the benefits of raw pet food, how to talk to your vet about it, or how to incorporate different raw toppers so that you have some percentage of raw and some benefits of raw in your pet's meals, regardless of what you're feeding. But one of the things that we haven't touched on yet is how to actually physically feed a raw diet. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I get a ton of questions about how to actually feed raw food once you've decided to switch to raw, and I personally didn't even think to make a video about that because it's just been second nature to me. I've been feeding my dogs completely raw for the past 2 or 3 years. But one of the things that you guys ask all the time is, okay, I've bought the raw food, now what? And it's a super easy process. We'll go through it today, and hopefully this helps to answer some of your questions about the preparation and the safety elements when it comes to feeding a raw diet. Today's video is going to be primarily focused on commercial raw pet foods for a couple different reasons. First of which being that's the most common. Most people who are feeding raw diets are feeding a commercially available raw pet food option. Secondly, commercial raw pet foods are a lot safer, at least in the United States, than the homemade alternative. Commercial raw pet foods are going to say whether or not they're complete and balanced, and they have to be complete and balanced according to the same standards and regulations as your kibble or your canned food. It's also required by the FDA to be completely free of pathogens like E. coli, salmonella, listeria, etc., which is the same safety regulations as the kibble or canned food. This video is also going to be focusing more on frozen raw versus freeze-dried raw. The practices are pretty much the same. The only difference is that you have to thaw frozen food and you have to rehydrate freeze-dried food. If you want me to do something specific about freeze-dried in the future, let me know. Other than that, you can just assume that everything's the same except for that one key difference of thawing versus rehydrating. Last but not least, we do have a sponsor for today's video. Today's video is sponsored by the brand We Feed Raw. We Feed Raw is a commercially available raw pet food that has a subscription-based service that ships directly to your house. This is super convenient for people who either don't have access to raw pet food locally, don't want to go and get raw pet food locally, they'd prefer to have it just shipped to their house. For people like me who aren't the best at remembering to get food before they run out, so then they're just kind of stuck for a day, either frantically thawing a bag of food or figuring something else to feed. It just takes a lot of that guesswork and a lot of that inconvenience out of the picture for you. Like I said, We Feed Raw ships directly to your house, on your front porch. All of the raw food is individually packaged and kept cold with dry ice, so even on days where I've had a long training day and I don't get home till late, my food's still nice and cold and pretty much frozen solid by the time I get back. We Feed Raw is also really great about being flexible in helping you meet the needs for your pet. For example, when I opened my We Feed Raw package, they had this handy dandy little sheet that has the suggested portion size for each of my dogs. This is based on estimated caloric needs, and they're really flexible if you need to add a little bit more or a little bit less. If you notice that you're maybe not feeding enough, your pet's losing some weight or they're gaining some weight, and it's just not quite perfect, you can let them know and they'll help you refigure that to make sure that it's gonna be right for your pet. We Feed Raw does have a pretty good selection of different proteins that they offer. Because my dogs don't have any allergies and I like a multi-protein kind of rotation element, I was sent the chicken, turkey, beef, lamb, duck, and venison varieties. My dogs love them all, they eat them all. I think their favorites are probably the duck and venison, but they'll eat all of them. They love them all. And if this video doesn't answer your questions as far as portioning and thawing and feeding goes, the little handout also has information direct from them with different ways to portion their foods and thaw their foods and feed their foods. So that's really handy to have with you as well, especially if you're new. I get a ton of people reaching out to me asking about raw food, especially from people who don't have access to high quality raw pet food locally, so they're wanting a shipped to your house online version, and I think that We Feed Raw is a really good option. To learn more about We Feed Raw, go ahead and check out the link in my description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again to We Feed Raw for sponsoring today's video. We are going to see a little bit more of them later in the video because that is what I'm currently feeding as far as raw pet food goes, and we'll get on with the video. The very first step when it comes to feeding a raw pet food is you're probably gonna have to thaw it. Most raw pet foods come frozen, and this is done for convenience, for shipping, just to make things a lot easier, because once it's thawed you really only have like 3, maybe 4 days to feed it before it's best to just move on. You can decide for yourself what method of thawing your pet's food is going to be easiest for you. I personally go through food pretty quickly between my 2 dogs, so I will take a stack of the We Feed Raw packets, put them out on the counter overnight, and then when I wake up in the morning, I'll put them in the fridge. Oftentimes when I wake up, they aren't completely thawed out. They're still a little bit frozen in the middle, especially when I do thaw them in a stack of like 4 or 5. And personally, that's how I like to do it. I like to have them in the fridge a little frozen because they are gonna thaw a little bit more in the fridge. I personally make sure that there's not any like chunks of frozen solid meat, but it is a little bit firmer when it is chilled, a little bit frozen still, as opposed to completely thawed out, and it just makes things a lot less messy and makes portioning a lot easier, and that's just the way that I prefer to do it. And for me, that means, you know, straight from the freezer to the counter, overnight, waking up, and it goes in the fridge. If you have less dogs or smaller dogs and you don't go through the food as quickly, you can always thaw it in the refrigerator and leave whatever you're gonna feed the next night out on the counter and do it that way. Because like I said, once it's thawed out, it's really only good in the fridge for like 3, maybe 4 days. So being able to plan ahead and figure out how many you should be thawing at a time is going to be really, really handy. Now that your food is thawed, you're actually like getting ready for mealtime. Very first thing you want to do is get your bowl out, and your bowl might actually matter a little bit more than you might have thought. It's not a make or break type of deal if you're using stainless steel or ceramic or plastic, but it is important to know that no matter what you're feeding, you should be washing your bowls regularly, ideally after every use. And 2, especially when you're feeding raw, I would recommend washing your bowls after every use. And that's just a cleanliness thing, that's just a safety thing. Even if you're feeding kibble and it's just straight dry kibble, you know, the saliva can get sucked into the pores of ceramics or plastics. The fat and all the oils on the kibble can get sucked in and go rancid. Wash your bowls. Ideally, stainless steel bowls are some of my favorites just because they're easy to clean, they last a lot longer, and even if you're using a plastic bowl, I recommend replacing it after, 3-4 months-ish. I personally use a mix. I do have a stainless steel slow feed bowl. I should probably get a second one. I have plastic slow feed bowls that I wash regularly and replace regularly. So whatever you choose to do it. Totally fine. Just know that, washing the bowls regularly, regardless of what you're feeding, is very important. Next, we're gonna go ahead and portion the food if you haven't already. If you have a smaller dog, you might not have to portion quite the same way I am because you just have the convenience of maybe not having to go through nearly a whole brick of food in one sitting. My dogs are on the bigger side. They go through the majority of a brick of food each whenever I go to feed them. So portioning is part of the job. When it comes to portioning your food and how much you should be feeding, it should absolutely say either on the package or in this case on your little handout how much your pet should be eating and how much each patty or nugget or whatever is. In this case, I know that this is a 16-ounce brick, and Luna, for example, should be getting 28 ounces of food a day. Knowing how big the brick is, as well as how much my dogs should be eating, lets me do a little bit of math. I feed 2 meals a day, so Luna should be getting 14 ounces a day. The brick is 16 ounces. So what I do is just kind of break it into half. So we have 8 ounces and 8 ounces. Then I take one of those and cut it into fourths so they're in 2-ounce chunks, and then I just take that little 2 ounce and set it off to the side. Pretty easy peasy as long as you have some basic math skills and you have the ounces they should be feeding. Sometimes you'll look on the back of the bag and it's like 1.5 patties, and that can be a lot easier for some people as opposed to doing the whole math thing. Only thing that you want to keep in mind with that is if you were to ever switch brands, or even sometimes just switching the protein is going to make that very, very different, and that kind of goes for all food in general. When you switch even a protein, sometimes that does change the amount of calories there, and you might have to adjust how much you're feeding. Just be sure to check that out because I've definitely seen discrepancies between proteins where, for example, if I was feeding the beef it would be 2 patties, but if I fed chicken, it would be 5. And those kinds of things you definitely want to be aware of at the very least. Once your food's portioned, you can just mush it on into the bowl or plop it in there if it's not a slow feed bowl. This is the part where some people get a little grossed out or get very concerned, because I just go in with my hands, mush things around. It's raw meat. What about the germs? And it's totally up to you what you decide to do about this. Some people wear gloves. That's like their routine. They don't like the feeling of it. They put on gloves. It makes them feel cleaner. It makes them feel safer. It makes them not have so much ick around raw food. That's totally fine. I think I maybe started with gloves for like 2 days when I first started feeding raw, and then got tired of the inconvenience of having to use them, and here we are. Like I said before, commercial raw pet food is actually safer than the raw meat that you bring home for yourself. In the United States, the FDA requires that all pet food, whether it be raw, cooked, canned, kibbled, has to be completely free of pathogens, no E. coli, no salmonella, no listeria, etc. Whereas again, in the United States, the FDA says that there can be up to 4% of those pathogens in regular butcher shop and deli meats and all those types of foods. So in theory, based on that, if I were to bring home my raw dog food and I were to bring home a raw chicken breast, as long as I feel safe and comfortable handling the raw chicken breast, I should absolutely feel safe and comfortable handling the raw pet food. Because one of them is required to be free of pathogens, the other one can have a little bit. So, in theory, raw pet food, safer than whatever you're probably handling already. That being said, it is still important to wash your hands after you're done handling your raw pet food, mostly for like cleanliness sake, and you know, you don't want the feeling of your raw pet food just sitting on your hands and touching like I don't need to explain why you should wash your hands after handling raw meat and bone. So yeah, just give your hands a little wash after you're done massaging your food into your pet's bowl. Just get that step out of the way. Keep it clean. If you dropped blood or fluids anywhere or meat anywhere, go ahead and wipe that up real quick. So that was pretty easy. We thawed the food, we portioned the food, we mushed it into the bowl. You could totally just call it good here. I personally like to add some toppers to my pet's food, and those toppers do change depending on, you know, the day, the time of year, what my dogs I feel like they need. This is the time where I would add in whatever toppers I'm feeding. Today I'm going to be feeding raw goat's milk. We're going to be doing bone broth. Sometimes I'll do like pumpkin puree, or if you're adding supplements to their food, this would be a good time to add the supplements. Any other additional goodies that you're putting in the food, I usually add it in at the end. So in this case, I'm using raw goat's milk. This stuff you just gotta shake up really well. Sometimes it looks like bad milk, because since it is raw, it's not permanently homogenized. It can look a little chunky and weird sometimes. Just give it a good shake, takes care of the issue. And then pouring that on in. And then I'm just following that up with the bone broth, adding a couple tablespoons of the bone broth to their meal, calling it good, and you can just feed this as is once you've added your toppers. When you're done feeding, if you have any portioned raw that still is there and needs to like be put somewhere, you're gonna want to put it in like a Tupperware or some kind of airtight container that you can put in the fridge. Stick that in the fridge, and like I said, 3-4 days tops is about how long it can stay in the fridge once it's thawed out. Definitely if you are having trouble feeding everything that you've thawed in that time frame, just thaw a little less at a time. It's fine. Just take a baby step, you're good. Some people totally like to be very precise and scientific with the portioning aspect. So for example, my dog has to have 28 ounces a day. Divide that by half, that's 14 ounces a meal. I could get out a food scale and be very precise and do exactly 14 ounces and take my time with it. If you're that kind of person, I'm jealous of you, props to you. You probably excel in a lot of different places in life that I don't. I am not that type of person. I am an eyeballer. I'm going to eyeball it and call it good, because ultimately it's gonna figure itself out. So if I accidentally do 13 ounces and then 15 ounces, like they're gonna be fine. Everything's fine. It's not that big of a deal. If that's your big stressor, you think that that's gonna go wrong and it's gonna ruin everything, as long as you can reasonably eyeball, you're totally fine. If you're somebody who wants meal times to be as quick and painless and convenient as humanly possible, you can also pre-portion. So for example, if you leave your food out overnight to thaw, when you wake up it's mostly thawed but still a little bit firm. That's a great time to take it out, to portion it up for however much that you're gonna need over the next 2-3 days, and then stick that in the fridge. It's a little bit more prep time initially because you're having to portion everything then, but if you're the type of person who has hectic mornings and just needs to run out of the house, or you don't have the time or patience when you're feeding them to take the time to portion things and figure that out, totally fine. That way it's just all pre-portioned, you can throw it in. That's also the really great way to go about it if you have, you know, someone in the house that's helping to feed the dogs but maybe isn't going to take the time or doesn't know how to do that whole portioning thing. If you have someone watching your dogs while you're away, you have a pet sitter over, you can just pre-portion. And I love the little the meal prep boxes that you can get pretty cheap. They're like not great Tupperware, but they come in a pack because they're intended for meal prep. Those are great. If you have someone coming over to watch your dogs and you're a raw feeder, you can just put everything in there and just tell them to flip it over in the bowl, call it good, and that way you can add in supplements and toppers and all sorts of things ahead of time. You can freeze whatever isn't going to get eaten in your 3 days and just make sure that they defrost them and thaw them out before they feed. But that is a really handy tip if you're somebody who travels without the dog but want to feed raw. Last but not least, when the meal is over, again, we want to keep things clean, especially if we're in a shared space. So picking up the bowl, cleaning it, cleaning the floor if you need to. Some dogs are a little messier than others. I hope you found this video helpful, or at least interesting to kind of see the process that I take whenever I go to feed my dogs. Like I said, this process is going to be different for everybody. You can add different toppers. Some people have different preferences of how things are done. You can make it as simple or as complicated as you'd like, but this is just the very simple, bare minimum, how to do things, get to point A to point B when you're feeding a raw diet to your pets. If you have any questions or anything you would like me to elaborate on in a future video, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. Give this video a like if you found it helpful and you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. We do a lot of training and nutrition stuff over here, so if you have a pet, dog, cat specifically, you might have some helpful videos to find over here. As always, you can also follow me on social media if you'd like between uploads. Primarily Instagram's my jam, so I have tattoo.dog trainers, the more me side of things, more